to Focus Today. I'm your host, Perry Atkinson. One of the questions that keeps popping up lately, why hasn't inflation gone down? Well, we have a professor to help us answer that question, and I'm always honored and delighted when we have Professor Michael Busler with us. He is a public policy analyst. He's a professor of finance at the Stockton University there in New Jersey. The professor has his own website, muckrack.com/Michael Busler. And there's a picture of his landing page and a lot of information going there. Professor, good to see you, friend. How are you?
I'm doing very well, Perry. It's great to see you, too, and thanks for having me on.
You bet. You're just a cool dude. Hey, let me ask you kind of an off-the-wall question. Have you ever taken the time to look through the federal budget?
Do you know how big the federal budget is?
Well, I know it's about this tall, but...
Yeah, I've looked through some items in there, not nearly as extensively as Elon Musk is looking at it, and he's finding all kinds of things that just shouldn't be there. You know, I wrote a column today on Newsmax about what Trump and Musk are trying to do is essentially use a technique called zero-based budgeting. So what does that mean? So for the last, I don't know how many decades, when the federal government puts a budget together, they say, look, we spent $1,000 last year. We need this, that, and the other thing. We're going to spend 5% more this year. And then if the public clamored that's too much spending, they would say, well, we'll cut it back to 3%. So therefore, we cut the budget. And what happens is you end up with these huge spending numbers that just aren't justified. Zero-based budgeting means instead of just adding on to last year, you go back to ground zero and take a look at every program in the budget and see what should be there and what shouldn't. That is the approach that Musk and Trump are taking, and Musk is going to find hundreds of billions, maybe even trillions of dollars worth of spending that simply should not occur.
You know, I should write my paper now and send it to you and get my PhD because I have zero-based budgeted this ministry from its inception.
Good for you. Good for you. It's a good way to keep a good handle on costs and to make sure that you're not spending money on things that you shouldn't. The other problem with this, what they call incremental budgeting, just to add on to last year, is that, you know, in government, they said, hey, look, we better spend everything that's been allocated to us before the end of the year, because if we don't, we're going to get cut next year. And that, too, added to it. The fact that you've used zero-based budgeting, Perry, is something to be admired. You're doing the right thing, and I'm sure the ministry's books are in very good order.
Thank you. Let me ask you this. So the fact that we are so overspent tells me that nobody's ever read the federal budget.
That's probably true. You know, a lot of times they bring a budget up for a vote, and it's literally a day or two before something expires, and you have to pass something or the government will shut down. What really started this, I remember when Obamacare was put forth in 2010, and Nancy Pelosi said to everybody to vote on it, and many people said, we haven't read it yet. And she said, well, you have to pass it first, and then you can read it. So that kind of logic has led to these this ballooning government spending. You know, in 2019, the federal government spent about $4.5 trillion, $4.5 trillion, 2019. This year, they'll spend close to $7 trillion. Now, I don't know where all that money was going. I think Elon Musk is doing his best to find it, but we really need to put a handle on this before this $36 trillion public debt becomes overburdensome, and we're fairly close to that point now.
Is it true that a lot of these agencies have never gone through an audit? And I heard yesterday that the Department of Defense has never been audited. Is that true?
Yeah, and if they had been, they end up failing the audit. A lot of these agencies have never been audited before. The IRS has never been audited. So Elon Musk is saying, look, we have to go back to ground zero. Let's justify all the spending in all of these agencies because we're using the American taxpayers' funds and we want to make sure we use it wisely. Again, you may recall that when Musk bought Twitter, he reduced the workforce by 75%. And Twitter, now called X, is operating very efficiently. So that's the kind of things he wants to do to the federal government, and it looks like he's going to be able to do it, although the Democrats are doing everything they can to try to at least delay him. I don't think they'll be able to stop him, but at least delay him.
Okay. Obviously, one of the things to be looking for is they not only find this waste and fraud, eventually you can't help but think it's going to be connected to kickbacks. That'll be a whole nother issue. But I guess my concern is, so he's finding the waste and he's stopping it. When do you think this will show up, not only in the economy, but show up in the deficit?
I think starting this year, a lot of things that have been approved to be spent this year because they were spent last year and they just added a little more onto it. Musk is going to say these things simply aren't needed. So I think you're going to see a reduction in spending. I don't know how dramatic it'll be, but at least somewhat reduction in spending this year. And going forward, I think in years to come, I think these reductions in spending will show up. Remember, he is suggesting eliminating entire government agencies. For instance, he looks at FEMA. And he says FEMA is extremely inefficient. There's a lot of money being spent there, and it's just not going to the right people. And there's so much bureaucracy, it becomes very costly for us to implement it. And he said, look, maybe a better way to, and Trump supports this, maybe a better way to do this is instead of giving the money to FEMA and let FEMA decide how to spend it, when a disaster occurs, just give the money directly to the states. And a good example, in North Carolina, they had the hurricane, all the flooding 5 months ago, and they're still not fully recovered from it when FEMA was in charge. Yet you take a look at Florida, and Governor DeSantis was in charge, and they had 2 major hurricanes knocking out roads and things, and in a short period of time, he got things as close back to normal as possible. So maybe we don't need a federal agency. Maybe we just give the money to the state and let them take care of it.
Not to mention the nonprofit organizations that go in humanitarian means and do a much more efficient job. I mean, it's $1 in and like 95 cents right to the cause.
Exactly. Some of these nonprofit agencies, not government affiliated, some of them go in and they have a different goal. They're wanting to help people as quickly and as much as possible, and they're not worried about bureaucracy and who should get what. They just have a goal of helping people, and it ends up being much more efficient.
So let me come back to something that's I pretty much understand where you are with tariffs, and I get it. I understand this. The question I would have is tariffs now that are being applied does raise prices, could worsen inflation. What do you think the president has in mind to offset the potential increase?
So President Trump, he did this in his first term too. He looked at all of the trade agreements that we have with every other country. Every one of them is slanted in favor of the other country and to the detriment of the U.S. For instance, the European Union is on now. They bring a car and sell it in the U.S., we charge a 2.5% tariff. We take an American car, sell it in Europe, they charge a 10% tariff. As a result, I think it was Trump or Musk that made the point, how many Chevrolets do you see driving around Paris? And the answer is you don't see any, because they put such a high tariff on it that they don't buy our products, yet we keep our tariffs low and we buy their products. That means a lot of our money is flowing out of the country because we're buying their products. Not much of their money is flowing into the U.S. because they're not buying much from us. We end up with this huge negative balance of trade, and that's what Trump wants to Correct. The other thing with tariffs, especially with China, there's a lot of products we make in China that are vital to U.S. consumers, healthcare products, for instance. I remember during COVID, when all of a sudden a mask that cost 40 or 50 cents, because everybody had to have one, the demand went way up. They were going for $5. So the American manufacturers make them in China. So they had a whole shipload on its way over here, and China said, wait a minute, the pandemic is a problem here too. They turned the ship around, went back to China, and we continued to have a shortage until American manufacturers were able to catch up. So Trump would like to see manufacturing, especially in those vital products, come back to the U.S. The reason they're in China is they pay their workers $1 an hour, and we pay significantly more than that. So it's cheaper to make them over there and bring them here, and that's why all that occurs. But now there's some negative aspects to that, and that vital products are made in China. So he'll argue, even if it costs a little bit more to make it in the U.S., we're far better off having these products made in the U.S. and more manufacturing jobs coming to the U.S. Now, your question was, how does he expect to offset the inflation? So if those products come back and they're more expensive to be made here, and he put a tariff on steel and aluminum so that more steel and aluminum will be made in the U.S., albeit at a higher cost. So the question was, how is he going to offset inflation? So what he said was, I'm going to vastly increase the supply of energy. That will bring, he is very optimistic, but he says he'll be able to cut energy prices in half by the end of the year. I think it's very optimistic. But even if it takes a little longer, when you knock energy prices down, energy accounts for about 8% of the consumer price index directly, because we buy gas and oil, et cetera, and almost 30% indirectly, because when we look at the cost of manufacturing, if energy prices go down, manufacturing costs are going to go down. So what he intends to do is bring energy prices down. That should offset much of the inflationary impact. He also wants U.S. companies who may be manufacturing in China now to come back to the U.S., and the lure will be he'll lower the tax rate on any product that was made outside the U.S. and is brought back to the U.S. to be made. He'll lower the tax rate on that down to 15%. Yeah. That should keep costs down, and it should be able to offset any inflationary impact.
I'm glad you said that, because I've been trying to do my own forecasting in a small business and using zero-base budgeting. I thought, you know what? I don't see the impact of Trump's changes until maybe the end of the second quarter, and that would be the earliest in my thinking. Am I on track or off track?
No, that's about right. People asked me, and I said, you probably won't see any impacts on this until about the middle of the year. So I think you're right on. By that time, he should have energy production expanded at least somewhat. You know, it takes time to drill a well and get the oil out of the ground and get it going. But he should have that expanded, and we should see by the middle of the year at least energy prices starting to fall. And again, hopefully that offsets some inflation.
One other off-the-wall question before I take a break. As he is trying to bring business back to the United States, especially from China, and the incentives are there not only through taxes, but one of the luring things out there that could be a factor are unions. And do you think unions have, I realize they're big and powerful, but in the end, do they have a place?
Well, I always thought unions were a good idea, simply because you're bargaining on one side against the business that's united as one. On the other side, you have a lot of workers, and bargaining individually puts them in a fairly weak position. So I always thought the concept of unions made sense to kind of even the playing field. However, once unions saw that they had some power, they started to ask for some ridiculous wage increases. Remember a few years ago when the dock workers went on strike? Right. They ended up getting a 62% wage increase over 5 years. And about that time, the auto workers went on strike, and they also got some ridiculous increase in wages over a 4 or 5 year period. Well, that's going to drive up the cost and make it more difficult for manufacturers to come back. Real quick, how they're going to offset that is they're going to use a lot of automation, a lot of artificial intelligence, robotics, and they'll start making the products more capital intensive than labor intensive, and that should help keep the costs down.
Remember when the air traffic controllers went on strike under Reagan?
He said goodbye. Come back to work or you're finished.
That was a moment. All right, let me take a quick break. Check out the professor's website, muckrack.com/Michael Busler. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Always an honor to have with us Professor Michael Busler. He's a public policy analyst. He's also a professor of finance at Stockton University in New Jersey. Since he's been on theDove, now you see him on all the other networks. I've seen him on Fox. I've seen him on Newsmax. Anyway, he does have a website, muckrack.com/Michael Busler. Always an honor to have you, sir. Do you think we are heading towards considering increasing the retirement age in America?
You know, the Social Security and Medicare will be bankrupt within 6, 8, 10 years. There is no good solution to fix the problem. So why do I say that? So they're bankrupt because they're spending more than they're bringing in revenue. So the only ways to fix that, you either cut the spending, which is simply not fair to all these people that have paid in their entire lives and are expecting Social Security to pay them in their retirement years. So it's not fair to cut any spending. You can't raise taxes either. I mean, right now we pay 6.2% of our wages, and the employer pays 6.2% for you. So you're actually paying 12.4%. You know, you tack on Medicare, which is 1.45% for both you and the employer, and you're essentially getting taxed over 15% of your wages just to cover Social Security and Medicare. So you can't raise taxes anymore. That means there is no good solution to this problem. When there's not a good solution to a problem, the next best thing to do is to find the solution that is the least bad. I believe, to your original question, the least bad solution is to raise the retirement age gradually. Don't do it all at once, but look, it was 65. They gradually raised it to the current 67. They're going to have to gradually raise it at least up to 70 and maybe more. And I know a lot of people say, well, I've been working all my life, I don't care. But the thing is, when Social Security was put in 1935, you collected at 67. The average life you collected at 65 rather, excuse me. The average life expectancy was 67, so it was only meant to carry you for a couple of years. Today, you retire at 67, the Social Security will tell you, plan to live for another 20 years. So people are living well into their 80s, 90s, and you have people living over 100. Well, you can't possibly ask the system to pay benefits to somebody for 30, 40 years. It just doesn't work. So while this is not a good solution, raising the retirement age, it is, in my opinion, the least bad solution. So the answer to your question is yes, I expect the retirement age to go up probably to about 70 gradually.
Okay. In the middle of Doge, they poked their nose in the Social Security office to the point where the Social Security person resigns, and they find millions of people being given benefits over the age of 100 to 125. So obviously there's a whole bunch of fraud there. You can only imagine, where did that money go? And if it stopped, how much would that go back into the Social Security Trust Fund?
I think a significant amount. I think Musk even found somebody that was 150 years old still collecting. So what ends up happening, somebody passes away, they never notify Social Security, and the checks just keep coming, and other family members must be spending it. That's illegal. It's been going on apparently for a lot of years, and also apparently there's a lot of money involved here. So the first thing that they'll do is get rid of the corruption and fraud that's involved, and that'll help. And once that gets done, then we'll start to look at some other solutions for saving the system. Maybe the solutions won't be as drastic as I thought. I thought raising the retirement age to at least 70, but maybe if we find out what they're actually spending and what they're supposed to spend, maybe it only has to go up another year or two. So we'll have to take a look at that.
Just on that point, quickly, Professor, if the family is caught taking the benefit and the individual is deceased, and it's against the law, is that money recoverable? Is that finable? How do you do that?
I don't think you're going to be able to recover it. Clearly, the people have broken the law. They're probably lower income people who just spent the money and lived a little better. I don't know how they're going to recover that. But the first thing to do is to stop it, so you're not doing any more, and then you could try to recover it. But I don't think they're going to be real successful at recovering that.
How will raising the retirement age affect business?
So I think it's a positive thing. People will be working a little longer, earning more income, and therefore spending more money. And for businesses, their workers that leave at 67, and usually the workers that are that old, they're very experienced. Their productivity is very high. So to have some of these workers stay on an extra year, 2 or 3, I think is going to help business. And even though things are what they are, we still have a relative labor shortage in that there are more job openings than there are unemployed people. Now you say, well, why don't the unemployed people just take the jobs? And the answer is it's a structural unemployment problem, which means the people that are laid off don't have the skills that match the job openings. Mm-hmm. So that's why they continue to be unemployed. But I think going forward, if some of these people in their 60s can stay a little bit longer, I think it's really going to help the economy, businesses, and the economy overall.
Are there any other entitlements that we could look at?
Well, the big ones, Social Security and Medicare, account for, I think, over 50%. It varies because the spending levels change. But vary, and it accounts for about 50% of government spending. Then there's 10% of government spending that is for the interest on this huge public debt, and that has to be paid. So we'll look at everything else, but everything else is only 40% of the budget. We're going to have to do something for those Social Security and Medicare, which are the majority of the entitlement programs, to be able to keep those programs solvent into the future. And we owe it to people who have worked their entire lives and are now retiring. We owe it to them to have Social Security and Medicare viable programs. So whatever we have to do that makes sense, I think we're going to have to do.
A little bit of a far-out question, but if we were to get to zero-based budgeting, if we were able to get the budget under control where it doesn't grow beyond all the nonsense, then would there be a need for the feds?
You mean the Federal Reserve or the federal government?
No, the Federal
Reserve. So that's a whole other argument. A lot of people say the Federal Reserve was set up to be what we call a quasi-public agency, so they don't have to listen to anybody. And the idea was that they would be independent. However, Chairman Powell, in my opinion, is the worst Fed chair since Arthur Burns in the 70s. He's made terrible mistakes all through 21 and half of 22. He kept telling us inflation was transitory. We don't have a problem. Meanwhile, it got up to 9% and then got embedded in the system. So finally, in June of 2022, they woke up and said, we've got to get inflation down. They raised interest rates from June 22 up to June 23, and then they stopped. I think they should have gone up a little bit higher back then. You would have reduced the inflation problem. So that was a second mistake. He stopped raising interest rates too fast. The third mistake, why did the Federal Reserve cut interest rates in September, November, and December? There's no economic reason for that. They say, well, we got to get the economy moving. The unemployment rate was 4.1%, which still is today. That's a full employment level. The economy last year grew at close to a 3% rate. No reason to stimulate it. They shouldn't. He made another mistake by cutting interest rates. Had he not done that, now you notice he started in September to cut the rates, and the inflation rate, which was heading down nicely, all of a sudden started up again. And now it's back up to 3%. The goal is to keep it at 2% or less. He's made a bunch of mistakes. So you hear a lot of people saying, maybe we don't need the Federal Reserve. Maybe the Treasury Department can handle this. I've always thought the Federal Reserve was needed. I'm starting to question whether that's the case.
Well, I think given the example you just explained, Professor, is a clear indication that it's been politicized because they lowered the rates to affect the election.
Yeah, they're not supposed to do that. They're supposed to be apolitical. But, all of a sudden, and to my thinking, there's no sound economic reason to cut the interest rates. And in fact, the market, they cut the federal funds rate. The market interest rates, looking at treasuries and mortgage rates, they have actually gone up since the Federal Reserve cut interest rates. They made a big blunder there, caused inflation to go up, and when inflation goes up, it tends to push interest rates up. Until we get this under control, and unfortunately the inflation is going to be a little sticky now because of what the Fed did, and now with all the tariffs in the short term, it'll be a while until we can really get this down under control. But President Trump's the one to do it. I have more confidence in him than I've had in any president I think I've ever seen.
Well, you can flunk Powell and give me an A. How's that?
Perfect. Works perfectly for me.
Good to see you. Thank you for your time. We value it greatly. Let me say to our viewers and listeners, go to muckrack.com/Michael Busler and check out all the resources and information is there. Thank you, Professor. Have a great day, my friend.
Thank you, Perry. My pleasure. Look forward to doing it again.
You bet.